The lectures are taken from, or based upon chiefly what St. Thomas teaches in part, the first part of the second part of the Summa, questions 1 to 5, dealing with the nature of moral activity, and the questions 6 to 21 of this first part of the second part we'll cover in part 2 of this video. The first topic begins with the all of the topics of both parts relates to how by being created in God's image, pursuit of happiness befits human beings. This is a befitting topic to take up after having discussed the nature of human freedom and how the pursuit of this end is that being made by a free agent. So the first topic is the ultimate end of human life as a principle of human life. The second is the nature of human happiness as the summum bonum, the highest good of human nature absolutely considered, whether the nature of human happiness consists in any created or contingent good. These contingent goods, as part of the second topic, include external goods like wealth, honor, fame, social and political power, and internal goods like bodily good, pleasure, any good of the soul, and any created good beyond that. Okay, he's first talking about here what happiness is not, before talking about what happiness is. In the third topic of discussion, we'll start to consider that on the nature of happiness, the necessary conditions for happiness, and how human beings gain happiness. So, beginning with topic A, the ultimate end of human life as the principle of human life, St. Thomas maintains, or it starts to talk about how by being created in God's image, human beings belong to a genus, and we do this as a part-whole composite. Every member of a genus, according to him, has an end and moves towards the end as a whole. As a free agent, human beings move toward the end of human life, the end of human nature, through an act of free choice involving consent of the will. By nature, every created agent moves toward an end. This is something we've emphasized from the start of this course. Like all agents, human beings get our specific difference as agents from the chief end, from our formal object. Like all composite wholes belonging to a genus, the specification comes within the genus. A species is generated by the perfect, more or less perfect possession of the generic aim within the formal principle of this member, this individual who's pursuing the end. All other ends are sought only as enabling means for achieving union with this formal object, which is a kind of a perfect achievement, satisfying the chief aim of the composite whole, not of one or all of its parts, divorced from achieving union with the chief end, which is the perfect organizational end, satisfying the good of the organizational whole. The ultimate end of any agent that is a composite whole is to move toward an end. It's only a member. A part is only a member of a whole to the extent that it has a chief aim that relates it to the other multitude that now belong to the same organization. The ultimate end of any agent move toward an end is to achieve union with the chief aim, which it considers to be a real good of its organizational nature, not the good of one of its parts. So, according to St. Thomas, for four general reasons, human happiness cannot consist in having any external good like wealth, honor, fame, social or political power, and the reason for this is that because human beings' happiness is chiefly internal. It's psychological. Having any or all of these goods does not provide for total self-sufficiency, lacking nothing, complete well-being, and the psychological conviction of possessing this. It doesn't prevent the inability of suffering bad luck, and the perfect satisfaction of human nature in knowing that you've reached the goal, that you've run the race and won it. For many reasons, St. Thomas says that happiness cannot consist in having any bodily good, any pleasure, any good of the soul, any created good, aside from these general reasons that he's given. No bodily perfection, he says, can cause human happiness because human happiness excels the happiness of every other species of animal perfection in kind. Happiness for St. Thomas is perfection. It's a perfection of the soul. To say that a person's happy is to say that a certain person in some way has become perfect as a human being. Even if we were to attribute happiness to that of an animal, the bodily perfection of animal life is of a lower intensive quantity. It's qualitatively lower than the happiness of a human being, which consists in a kind of spiritual greatness, a greatness of soul. Other animals excel human beings in some bodily perfections, Thomas says, but no bodily perfection can totally satisfy the whole person, can put it to rest, can calm it, the way the fruition of rest in the soul does in the knowledge of having achieved perfect good. Just like no active part of an organization can satisfy the organizational good, say, of delivering a product and satisfying a customer. Human happiness consists in a composite being united to a good beyond itself, its formal object, its external stimulus, what's moved it from the beginning to act. In a way, being united to a good beyond itself is true for every created nature, according to St. Thomas, for every organizational whole. No bodily or created good consists in union of human nature with perfect good and perfect truth. Now, because happiness consists in being totally perfect in human nature, human happiness has to consist, according to St. Thomas, in an activity, because each thing is perfect in as much as it's actual, not potential. It's got to consist in an activity perfectly satisfying the person as a composite whole. Going on to the next topics of discussion here. It's got to satisfy the intellect, the will, the glorified body. It's an activity of delight, St. Thomas says, not simply of a delight like that of pleasure, but he calls it fruitioning, a kind of blossoming of the human nature, as an overflow of perfection that's generated by perfection. So it's a kind of property that becomes achieved in human nature as a kind of beautification of the soul, as a human being recognizes being at rest and being calmed by the union with perfect beauty, perfect truth, and perfect goodness. So it's a contemplative activity, satisfying the whole person through a vision of God's essence and a knowledge of that business. It's a perfection of the soul overflowing into the glorified body in its fullest sense, but even then is before that reunion with this body that, as a Catholic theologian, St. Thomas accepts. St. Thomas maintains that this beautification process, this fruition, is to a good extent already achieved. Such happiness, finally, in the last topic, requires divine assistance to attain. Once it's attained, it cannot be lost. All human beings desire happiness as complete satisfaction and perfection of the will. Not all human beings realize that this is what the complete satisfaction and perfection of human nature consists in, and as a result, some do not achieve it. We started to get into St. Thomas's moral teaching and good and evil in relationship to that teaching. We're concentrating on the first part of the second part of the Summa, Theology, where St. Thomas discusses these topics. In this class, we'll be covering questions 6 through 21 of the first part of the second part related to moral activity. We're going to be covering an enormous amount of material in a short period of time, and so I'm going to move quickly along. We're going to be discussing 7 new topics in this part of the class. Voluntariness in general, voluntariness as a general principle of moral activity. What the will wills, more specifically considered, that is a more specific consideration of what the will wills. How the will is moved to will. 3 acts by which the will is moved toward the end: volition, intention, and enjoyment. Volition is a natural desire, that is. 5 acts by which the will is moved regarding means toward an end: counsel or deliberation, choice, consent, command, and use, which can also be translated as application, employment, or several other ways. Then the goodness and evil of moral acts considered in general, in the interior act of the will, and in exterior actions. That's all part of one topic. And finally, the consequences of moral activity by reason of their being good or evil. In going over this material, I'm going to be looking down a lot of the notes because there's so much content and condensed into a short period of time. So I apologize for that in advance. But anyway, to continue, because strictly speaking, moral acts, or human acts, as St. Thomas calls them, are freely chosen actions of free decision-making. St. Thomas maintains that, strictly speaking, voluntary activity is proper only to human beings, to rational animals. Voluntary activity springs directly from the will under the advice of the intellect to move toward or away from an end. And several principles influence the voluntariness of an action. Voluntariness is, in moral activity, refers to acts of the will, acts the will commands, and to its natural inclination to pursue its natural end. With respect to acts the will commands, voluntariness can be increased, decreased, St. Thomas says, or nullified when done under coercion, that is violence, or emotions like fear and pleasure, and antecedent, consequent, and conjoined ignorance. Then there's different types of ignorance can also influence the voluntariness of an act and totally eliminate it. Antecedent ignorance he refers to through an example of a person who's an archer and is shooting at a target. Somebody crosses a field and gets shot by the arrow. This is not something that is directly intended by the archer, and it was not anticipated that this would occur. So the moral responsibility is absent. It's regarding conjoined ignorance if the person happens to have been someone that a person wanted to shoot anyway. This might be an act of good luck for the person in question, and one might say, well, he has moral responsibility for it. But St. Thomas maintains, strictly speaking, it's a non-voluntary action. Once again, the person did not directly intend this and could not anticipate it. As far as consequent ignorance, St. Thomas considers this to be a kind of ignorance that is performed through direct will. You willfully are ignorant of something, so that you can excuse yourself from responsibility for the effects of your actions. Now, in referring to these to human activity, moral activity, as voluntary or human, identified with moral, what St. Thomas is doing is talking strictly speaking, just like we would say that the person who heals a person, strictly speaking, is not this or that individual, but a doctor through the medical habit. Okay, so it's through this faculty of reason, through this faculty of free decision making, that strictly speaking, we perform freely chosen actions, actions for which we are responsible as authors, because we've freely deliberated about them and decided to perform them. So the will, according to St. Thomas, wills the good as apprehended, a known good. Facultatively, it aims, like all faculties do, at a real good activated by a formal object or an external stimulus, seeks union with that. But because the will is pursuing that good under the direction of knowledge that is being given to, presented to the will, or is directing the will that's coming from the intellect, and since the intellect never apprehends the perfect good as perfect, everything that the will is willing is a kind of imperfect good. It can never be so perfect that the will is forced to choose it. More specifically considered, the following move the will. The intellect, through knowledge, concerned with a proportionate or suitable good to present to the will. The sense appetite influences how the good is apprehended and considered and known by the intellect. For example, people who are emotionally stressed out, angry, or so forth, in fear, this influences their ability to conceive of a situation correctly and report in a suitable way to the good, to the human will about real goods and evils. The will moves itself, St. Thomas says, by means of willing the end. Other enabling means external to a human being, physical objects, for example, move the will. Mental acts, like deliberation, move the will. The human emotions, St. Thomas says, don't move the will by necessity, but nonetheless influence it. And God, as a universal and special mover, moves the will. As the universal good of the universe and creator of everything, as a creator of the human soul, God moves the will by causing its nature, causing its existence, causing its ordination to take direction by reason. And God moves the will by grace. By its nature, with a necessity of natural inclination, St. Thomas maintains, the will voluntarily wills the good of its own powers. It wills its proper object, its natural end, everything suitable to all natural powers of a human being, the good of the whole of human nature, and everything that befits the fulfillment of natural needs. Now, strictly speaking, because it pursues these as known goods voluntarily, the will need not choose any of these. Regarding the second object toward which the will moves, as an end. Intention, St. Thomas says that intention is chiefly or an act of the will, not the intellect, but it involves the intellect as a in as much as the will direct the intellect to plan means for securing the end. So intention, whilst chiefly in the will, is directly related to reason in pursuing the end. Intending is not identical for St. Thomas with simply wanting. It's an act of planning. What the will intends us to do, it stretches out toward so strongly that it moves us to plan, to perform appropriate means for action. And those activities have to be performed by reason. So it calls upon reason to engage in those plans in order to execute what it wants done. Intention is an act of the will that employs reason to direct and order actions in a suitable way to realize an end. So basically it uses reason to prioritize activities to secure an end. Regarding actions that move toward the means, relate to the means toward the end, the first of these St. Thomas talks about is counsel or deliberation. It's the first of 5 acts that move the will related to means, fulfilling intention, to act for an end. After the will calls upon reason to prioritize action, because the means, the matter reason considers are contingent, doubtful, uncertain, are multiple. Before concluding a judgment, reason questions the relationship of potentially suitable means to ends. And in doing so, it also questions the potentiality of the powers of the agent in relationship to the magnitude or greatness of the nature of the means involved in relationship to the end. Counsel can involve many people, according to St. Thomas, or it can involve one person. He maintains it cannot go on endlessly because the will intends counsel to be limited. It consists in appetitive movement to something existing within one's power. It must involve then cogitative reason before choice can be executed. It's got to measure the nature of the agent, natural ability, which we first, as I said before, sense on the level of a particular reason or cogitative reason. And so in preparing for counsel, for deliberation, human reason has to call upon the human, this particular reason, cogitative reason, to give information about natural powers and abilities. If we're sick, for example, if we're weak, if we're emotionally distraught in one way or another, this faculty, this estimative power, will call our attention, does call our attention to these elements. It's through this that we get the sense, well, I feel sick, or I just feel too weak to do something, or you feel the endorphins kick in, and you feel as if you can take on the world. At least as far as I can see, this is this power St. Thomas locates, and Aristotle locate prudence in relationship to executing action in the individual situation. So it's crucial. It's a crucial principle for moral education. Education in ethics is chiefly an education of cogitative reason, and cogitative reason's education of the concupiscible appetite, the pleasure and pain seeking appetite. in relationship to finite goods and infinite good. In relationship to the execution of counsel, people in business will often engage in it by asking themselves on the sense level and also in a more abstract level, is something doable? Is it doable by us? In fact, Aristotle refers to this in his Nicomachean Ethics, this way of that people in business ask such questions. If it's not doable by us, is it doable by somebody else that we know? If it is doable by somebody else that we know, do we have the means to get in touch with that person? If so, easily or with difficulty, and so on. These are the types of things, elements about which counsel will consider in its deliberation. Because of the fact that it requires deliberation, it is not something, according to St. Thomas, that strictly speaking animals employ. Because animals more or less jump to the conclusion and can't estimate all of these conditions. They tend to act instinctively to situations without recognizing the internal mechanisms, the complicated part-whole relationships that are involved in principles of actions within things. Following upon counsel, St. Thomas maintains that the act of consent is related to means, inasmuch as an appetitive agreement must come into being to execute movement, to act, and this exists within the power of the will, chiefly, but also in the emotions and so forth. And it puts uncertainty to rest. You're now decided, I'm going to act, I'm going to do this. This could still be interrupted by other elements that might come in that would frustrate your ability to make a choice. But most often that's not going to be the case. So choice then ensues after consent. And this involves comparing real possibilities, imperfect goods. It uses reasoning to compare, one good to another good, imperfect goods, whereby it can conclude a judgment. Now, choice, strictly speaking, even though St. Thomas, I don't know whether he mentions this anywhere, but Plato does, and it's one of the elements that makes the thinking of Socrates so powerful. Plato mentions, and just by seeing how St. Thomas talks, he knows this, that choice is strictly speaking only of two objects. It's of relationships and actions, and that relate to human beings. We cannot choose things, strictly speaking. We choose actions and relationships toward things. You don't choose a car or an automobile or a dress or so forth or a house. You choose to buy a house, to wear a dress, to drive an automobile, to eat food and so forth. You choose to have facultative relationships, most often through habits, to different things. And so the act of habituation, strictly speaking, relates to developing our own faculties, bringing them to mature development. This is what one of the elements with which moral activity is chiefly concerned. The following choice, which is, as I've said before, a combination of an act of the intellect as well as an act of the will. The command is generated by reason. It's an act of reason that executes choice through faculties, that causes faculties to be moved, and this is done through the cooperation of the will, which moves the imagination and the other sense faculties and sense appetites in cooperation with reason. So command will engage the different faculties to be put to use. The command, according to St. Thomas, is an act of reason presupposing an act of will. And it moves faculties that are amenable to be moved by reason, like reason itself, like the will in relationship to reason, the appetites, bodily movements, and so on. Having finished the general consideration of moral or human activity, St. Thomas considers the goodness and evil of moral activity in general, in the interior act of the will, and in exterior actions. First, regarding the goodness and evil of moral activity considered in general, St. Thomas says, because form is the principle of intrinsic activity that generates action in things, discussion of good and evil in things should be done by considering the form being considered. In created material beings, form or nature is always a composite whole in the act of self-maturation. Every finite whole is an imperfect whole. It possesses organizational unity of its parts more or less perfectly. It can be deprived of the complete organizational wholeness that constitutes its organizational perfection. So, for example, the human person as a body-soul composite is a whole constituted of facultative and organic parts, like the faculty of sight, which can fail at times. People can have imperfect vision as well as blindness. To be good, to act, an organizational whole must have a bare minimum of essential parts that enable it at a minimum to be this or that type of organization in a most imperfect, say, manifestation. It hasn't fully developed into this mature organization, but it has the essential parts needed so that it can act. If an organizational whole is missing an organizational part needed to act with full perfection, to that extent the organization is somewhat deprived, weak, bad, not absolutely good. As a composite whole, St. Thomas maintains that every finite action is good to the extent that the action is missing no part needed to be the composite whole that it is. This is what is meant by being good. Since every acting form is a species, a more or less perfect having of a generic organization, whole, or unity, you have to judge the goodness or evil of finite forms, according to St. Thomas, depending upon the organization, in relationship to which this form is a more or less perfect participation. More or less perfect participation in the goodness of the organizational aim. He calls it a bonum ex genere, a good from the genus, out of the genus, or in the genus, or an evil in the genus. To determine the good or evil of anything, St. Thomas says, you first have to ask, what kind of organization are you dealing with? Okay? You can't know it's the species of good or evil you're dealing with, how good or bad something is, unless you know the type of organization. And you can't judge good or evil in this world of ours except in relationship to a composite whole. No notion of an aim, no notion of an end, no notion of parts of whole relationships, no notion of contrary opposites existing within a common organization. You have no way of judging good and evil. They cannot exist. So if you don't adhere to these kinds of principles that St. Thomas is talking about, there is no way that you're thinking about good and evil with respect to any kind of an organization can help but become anarchic. which is the result today of so many people trying to apply principles of mathematics and in those influenced by mathematics to consider action, which mathematicians can never, strictly speaking, fully comprehend. Considered as specific acts of some sort of a general organization, St. Thomas claims that to be specifically good or bad, moral acts must be animal acts, acts within the genus animal, done by a rational animal. Moral good and evil are specific differences, rationally caused acts, freely chosen acts. So there are specific differences in rationally caused acts and freely chosen acts. The moral goodness or badness of an act as human is derived from an end intended by the human will, inasmuch as that act is or is not well deliberated about, whether or not it's prudent, whether or not it's really good or evil for the species of rational animal, whether or not it's intended as really good or evil by rational animals. Considered specifically as human acts, moral acts, according to St. Thomas, have a twofold component, or end intended, an internal activity and an external activity. The moral goodness of an external act, he says, is derived from the moral goodness of an internal act. The same thing with respect to the evil. The moral goodness or evil of an internal act, in turn, is derived from the moral goodness or evil of an internal act's aim. Specific acts within the genus of human acts, he adds, derive their moral form as good or evil from the chief aim that generates them, which is to choose in conformity with right reason. Moral habits of choice generate a moral activity. So whether we choose well or badly is going to depend upon our moral habits of choice. If the chief aim of a moral choice is to choose an action as a real means leading to the chief aim of human life, is a prudent choice leading to union with God, the individual choice made is specifically good morally, according to St. Thomas. If the chief aim is to make an imprudent choice, leading away from union of the soul with God, it's specifically bad. Not all acts of human beings, St. Thomas adds, are that we perform under the influence of reason and will are moral acts. Some are morally neutral, for example, like scratching your head, or your cheek, or taking a walk, and so forth. Moral acts are, first of all, deliberately chosen acts. Choice, as St. Thomas tells us, is of the actual, and therefore it must be of the possible. Right? This is why choice involves engaging an understanding of our natural powers, as well as the circumstances and conditions under which we are acting, like the time and place where we're engaging in an action. Because at times what are circumstances in other conditions become essential parts of the nature of a moral activity in the individual situation, because the fullness of the moral act is achieved in choosing this or that. It's in choosing this or that action under the direction of specific habits, qualities of soul for which we praise or blame, reward or punish people. The complete nature of moral activity, according to St. Thomas, must take into consideration circumstances within which a choice is executed. This is why we have to deliberate beforehand, one of the main reasons. While not changing the species of evil or good, circumstances sometimes increase or decrease the greatness and intensity of good or evil. If, for example, a person performs a virtuous action under extremely hazardous conditions, like ones of courage that many people in the military engage in, for example, this intensifies the greatness, the magnitude of the courageous act. At other times, what had been an incidental circumstance, like place and time, enters into the moral nature, the good or evil of an action, and changes its species as being prudent or imprudent, morally good or morally evil. A moral activity, a circumstance can achieve a status as part of a moral act, essential part, as a quality like a specific difference within a genus. What had been a circumstance now becomes an essential part of the chief aim that makes a choice of means prudent or imprudent. What had been a circumstance now becomes something like a specific difference, not exactly a specific difference. Examples of this that are easily recognizable are stealing food from a wealthy person or stealing it from a poor person, a starving person. That changes the moral nature of the action. What had been a circumstance, you're stealing something from somebody's house. Okay. You're stealing it from a person with enormous wealth. You're stealing it from a person who, if this person doesn't have this food, is going to die. One can make you an accessory to manslaughter at the very least. The other is, a minor kind of vice. Lying about someone, for example, in school. Lying to someone under oath in a court of law. Plato gives this example in Book 1 of the Republic under the character of Socrates in relationship to a definition Socrates attributes to Cephalus, namely returning weapons to a friend who had given these weapons to you when sane and now asks for them back while insane. The first act of justice, which Socrates would maintain, appears now to become an act of injustice. St. Thomas starts his consideration of good and evil in interior acts of the will by maintaining that, once again, interior acts of the will are specified by formal objects. A good represented to the will through reason as being right or wrong, prudential or not prudential, unless they enter into the formal object presented to the will. What is usually called a circumstance does not specify moral acts as good or bad. And since a prudent intellect is part of the formal object of the moral goodness of an act of will, such moral goodness or evil depends upon reason, depends upon deliberation and prudential judgment. So these judgments about singular circumstances and conditions and how they enter into the nature of a moral act become moral principles, first principles that have to be known by means of experience, that are analogous to first principles of understanding that have to be known before being able to engage in speculative thought. And they're analogous in moral studies, in moral science, to first principles in metaphysics. In fact, St. Thomas says a knowledge of the principles of understanding and of prudence are actually superior to those of science. They are so complicated, so difficult, and so important to understand, because the whole of our practical reasoning depends upon them, just like the whole of speculative reasoning depends upon principles of understanding. Through divine will and eternal law, St. Thomas says, God has established that the human will take direction from human reason. By following the directives of human reason, St. Thomas maintains that a person is following directives of eternal law. Right? St. Thomas adds that this requirement to follow reason, especially prudent reason, is so crucial that even a mistaken conscience binds. God has ordained by divine law, by divine reason, eternal law, that the human will take direction from reason. Every act against reason, he says, is always bad, unless performed through willed ignorance or some sort of rational disorder like insanity and so on. Goodness of an act of the will depends upon good intention. And even though a good intention might not generate a good choice, he claims that often it strengthens, increases goodness in the will that lends to the production of a good action. Regarding a good choice. Regarding good and evil in external acts, St. Thomas claims that the nature of moral good or evil in outward acts depends upon the species of act in question, which includes circumstances under which the act is performed. For example, to give alms to the poor, to show off, which St. Thomas maintains is specifically bad. In an external act, good or evil is first present in intention. Then it is present derivatively by reason entering the will's plan to execute an act. The entire goodness of an act, of an external act, he says, depends upon intention of a good and choice of the right means. The external deed adds some good or bad to the internal act. Unintended effects, as a last topic we're considering here, St. Thomas says that those unintended effects that rarely result from performance of a good or evil act add nothing to the moral good or evil of the preceding action. Moral acts proceed in conformity with right reason and eternal law are morally right. Contrary acts are morally wrong. Because we are the authors of our own moral choices, we must praise or blame for be praised or blamed for acts we freely cause under our control, and be rewarded and punished for them. Regarding whether these acts of merit, reward, or punishment, St. Thomas says that through the quality of being directed toward others individually and as members of community, human action, performing human actions that help or hurt others are meritorious and non-meritorious before God, the governor and ruler of the community of the entire universe, with whom St. Thomas says that by this third act of intention, which I failed to mention in going over, this third act of seeking that follows on intention and after choice and so on, namely enjoyment. The last act that we pursue directly as an end which he calls fruition. which is a kind of a delight, not identical with pleasure, because it's more like today what we today would call jumping for joy. It's the kind of enjoyment that comes to an individual who has been engaged in a difficult exercise activity and has finally been able to achieve a state of fulfillment, has finally achieved victory, and can sit back and rest in enjoyment of a job well done.